Harry's durance vile came from. Robert Burns, the Scottish poet. In durance vile, here must I wakened weep. Her son's laughter broke her mood, and she shook herself out of poetic melancholy. It was not at all in her nature, and compared to most, she was a fortunate woman. She was a widow, to be sure, but that sadness was nearly a year old, and she had a handsome jointure that meant she need never fear poverty. And she had Harry, the joy of her life. She watched him roll his red leather ball again and demolish at least half the blocks. He was developing a good eye for a 3-year-old, but then his father had excelled at every type of sport. Harry got his dark curls from her. The rest of him was pure Gardeyne, square chin, brown eyes and hair, and the promise of height and strong build. His next attempt sent the whole tower flying. Laura put aside the paper and applauded. "Well done, Harry, well done." He hurtled to her for a hug, then back to roll his ball at the rebuilt target. It hit only the corner, but it made a sound like an explosion. He raced back to her again. "Mamma! Mamma!" Laura caught him up, thinking, thunder? But crows had risen cawing into the grey sky. It had been a shot. Laura realized immediately what had happened, but she still held her son close. "Don't be frightened, Minnow. It's just your Uncle Jack enjoying some sport." The maid came over. "Shall I take Master Harry in, Ma'am?" "No, of course not. Reverend Gardeyne would never aim his gun near us, and Harry's enjoying himself, aren't you, darling?" After an uncertain moment, Harry nodded and scrambled off her lap to run back to his game. With hard-won skill, Laura kept a slight smile in place, as she watched, then as she let her eyes move to the coppice wood that spread between the house and the village of called St. Edwin's. The shot had come from there, but the wood offered no extra information. The crows had settled, and there was nothing to see. Surely she'd spoken the truth. Her brother-in-law would not be careless about where he aimed his gun. Jack Gardeyne was vicar for the local parishes of St. Edwin's and St. Mark's, and a good one. As with all Gardeynes, however, hunting, shooting, and fishing were the true joys of his life. In 6 years of marriage, Laura had grown accustomed to living among dogs, horses, and firearms. Guns hadn't bothered her until recently, until she had begun to suspect that the Reverend Jack Gardeyne would like Harry dead. Now sweat trickled down her spine. She tried, as she did all the time, to convince herself that no man, especially a vicar, would wish harm to his innocent nephew. Even if the child did stand between him and a title, a fortune, and all the hunting, shooting, and fishing he could want. She wasn't convinced, and she couldn't stop herself from hovering over Harry's play as if watching could hold off disaster. No one could watch a child all the time, however, and as he grew older it would become impossible. A boy must be allowed to explore and have adventures, but as things stood now, Laura didn't know how she could bear to let him out of her sight. She noticed that he was throwing the ball more wildly and becoming frustrated. Time for his nap. Then she leapt to her feet and ran. Harry had hurled the ball right past Nan. It was rolling down toward the river, and he was chasing it, but that wasn't what alarmed her. A black dog had streaked out of the woods with the same intent. The dog got there first and snatched the ball in its sharp teeth. Harry had already reversed. He'd spun around and was fleeing toward safety, toward her. She swung him into her arms and held him close, murmuring reassurances that she could hardly hear over her own thundering heart. "Don't be cowardly, custard, Harry. Bouncer won't hurt you." Laura glared over her child's head at the source of the hearty voice. Jack Gardeyne was strolling toward them, jolly smile in place. How could anyone see him as a monster? He was a fleshy man, portly around the middle, but strapping, like all the Gardeynes, and full of vigour and bonhomie. He carried a gun under his arm, but safely pointed down. In his casual country clothes he looked as harmless as could be, but his free hand gripped the legs of a dead pheasant, its limp head brushing the grass. Laura was not mawkish about dead animals, but at this moment the corpse made her shiver. "Your uncle's right, darling," she said, hiding her tension. "His dog won't hurt you." She made it a statement for Jack, rather than for her son. When Nan hurried up, Laura passed Harry to her, then went to his retriever and grabbed the ball. "Release, Bouncer." Bouncer snarled deep in his throat. Though fear leapt inside, Laura didn't let go. She wanted Jack to know that he faced not only a small child, but her. She stared a demand at him. His smile set a little. "Bouncer, release. Heel." The dog let her have the ball and turned to settle at his master's side. It was surely her imagination that saw a sneer in its panting expression. Jack shook his head. "Laura, my dear, dare I suggest that perhaps you are a little over-protective of Harry?" He'd started this line recently, trying in subtle ways to separate her from her son. She feared that he was slowly turning his father, Lord Caulford, to his side. "He's only 3, Jack," she said, drying the ball on her handkerchief. "There'll be time to toughen him up later." She attacked back. "I'm surprised to see you out. We received word that Emma's confinement had started." "Nothing for a man to do there," he said. "In the way, in fact. I've been through this 3 times before, remember." "But I hope all is going well." "Midwife said so. Hoping for a boy, of course, this time. Father would be pleased. Always good to have a spare as well as an heir." Laura's throat tightened, but she looked straight at his cheerful face. "I'm sure it is, though it's unlikely that anything will happen to Harry, isn't it? Children don't die as frequently as they used to." "God be praised. But still, his divine will takes some innocence. Wise men pray for the best, but prepare for misfortune." He nodded. "Good day to you, sister. I'll drop by to see how father is, then get back home." She watched him stroll toward the house, corpse dragging on the grass, trying to persuade herself that the threat was entirely in her imagination. Jack Gardeyne was a man of God, and a good enough vicar in his way. He ran the services responsibly, preached excellent sermons, and organized the care of the less fortunate of the parishes. He was a good father and a kind husband. In fact, he seemed to care for his Emma more than Hal had cared for her, once the first bloom was off their marriage. She looked at Harry and saw he was limp in Nan's arms, his head on the maid's shoulder. "Time to go in, Minnow," she said, as if nothing unusual had happened, and bent to gather up the blocks and ball, wishing Jack hadn't been on his way up to the house. She didn't want another encounter. She sighed. It was considerate of Jack to visit his ailing father so often, to talk with him, play cards, and perhaps laugh over wicked, manly jokes. Laura would have done the same, even the latter, but Lord Caulford didn't care for the conversation of women. He also believed women should never gamble, and he enjoyed playing cards only.